Okay, hello to everybody who is here on YouTube. Thank you for coming to the Dragons on a Spaceship panel. I'm excited to invite you all to the CoNZealand Fringe. That's being hosted here on YouTube. I know everyone in the BookTube community is very excited to have you. And at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Bogi.
Hello, everyone. I think we're just going to begin with a round of introductions where everyone could say just a few words about themselves, and also maybe one sentence or two about why we think science fantasy is an especially interesting topic right now. And then we will begin with our general topics from there. So let's try to do it clockwise. So Jeannette, I think you are starting.
Hello, I'm Jeannette. I wrote a book called Under the Pendulum Sun. It's got missionaries in fairyland. It's right. And I'm up for a Hugo this year for saying Campbell is fascist, apparently. So I'm sort of like two things to say.
Am I going next? Hi, I'm DongWon Song. I'm a literary agent with the Howard Moreham Literary Agency. I represent science fiction and fantasy primarily for adult, YA, middle grade audiences, plus some graphic novels and things like that. A little bit of nonfiction. But, I think this is a totally fascinating topic. I think science fantasy is kind of blowing up across the industry, and I'm sure we will get into why and sort of where that's coming from and how genre works.
Right. Oh, hi, I'm Suyi, Davies Okungbowa. I'm Suyi. I am an author, a Nigerian author of all the speculative fictions, particularly where they cross and overlap. I'm the author of David Mogul God Hunter, which is this book, which is about a god apocalypse in Lagos, which is exactly what it means. And so, yeah, that's a good example, for instance, of how I think about how genres, cross over each other. When we think of apocalypses, we usually think of some sort of nuclear or technological stuff, but in this case, it's like a fantastic apocalypse, etc. So yeah, currently I live in Tucson, Arizona, and I work with the University of Arizona, where I teach writing, and I'm also completing my MFA in creative writing.
Cool. I am nodding so hard that everybody's introductions that my headphones are falling off. So sorry about that. Okay, so a few words about me as well. I'm Bogi Takács, and I'm going to be moderating the panel. And I am a really big fan of science fantasy. I write primarily short stories, and I have a collection titled The Trans-Space Octopus Congregation, which I think the title shows that it has a little bit of everything. And I hope that we will get to discuss how those things all fit together. And I would actually begin with one of the related topics. I want to discuss both structural trends in the industry about science fantasy, but I also want to do a round of recommendations and reading ideas. So I want to make sure that the panel kind of has a balance of both. But let's start with more of the structural things. So the panel description also notes that there has been a big resurgence of science fantasy lately. And I have also noted, I have a column at Tor.com, which is about quilt bag books in SFF before 2010. And I really noticed that a lot of books that I've been reviewing for it have been like science fantasy books and really big, wide scope science fantasy books. So it made me wonder if there's a connection between an increase in the genre becoming more inclusive toward people's identities also results in more inclusivity related to topics and themes. So what do you think about that?
I mean, I definitely think that more marginalized perspectives are, pulling in different metaphors, right? And I think, the experience of colonized peoples or queer folks or disabled folks, I think that does tend to lead towards a little bit more magical thinking. I'm not quite sure I know how to exactly articulate what those connections are, but I do think that it's drawing in different cultural perspectives and different ideas about sort of how the world operates, and what are the core metaphors that we're engaging with. And I think blending across those cultural lines is very similar to blending across genre lines for me, right? Like, it feels like we're all trying to bring in different ideas, different ways of telling stories, different imagery, and that really leads to just grabbing from all over the genre sort of landscape in a way that for me is incredibly exciting, and I think is a really vital time in science fiction and fantasy and the genre overall. So.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've kind of got the thing where we're seeing a new generation of authors but we're not just inspired by a certain legacy and certain vision of what science fiction is about. I mean, if you kind of want to play the whole, like, where does our current ideas of science fiction come from? Where does hard science fiction come from as an idea? That all kind of you kind of have to go back to the magazines, you go back to Campbell, you go back to the people who were really into fetishistically into very specific sorts of science, and they would commission stories or want stories that specifically have these long rambling descriptions of science in the middle of it. Specifically, writers would cater to that. They would take a story and they would crib a bit out of some kind of physics textbook and throw it in. And it's not even necessarily right. It's just that they know that's what these magazine editors wanted, because they had this idea of science. And when they say science, they don't mean all science. They don't mean geology. They don't mean the social sciences. They don't mean anthropology. They always mean physics. And it's barely even biology or even ecology. It's always physics, and a sprinkling of engineering. So I kind of get really uncomfortable with the idea of hard science fiction, because it kind of has that kind of very straight line route from the thinking of these people, what they think science fiction should be, to the now. And kind of we're looking at now, what is science fiction? If you ground science fiction in a different science, why is it not science fiction? Like Broken Earth gets called, geological science, sci-fi, and it has kind of quite a lot of crunchy details in a way that that isn't the way word fantasy can make you think it's kind of very fuzzy, or that it doesn't care about rules or whatever, but it does. And I think that, and I suppose, to me, when you're grounding science fiction in different, a non-physics, or even if it is physics, what I want is something that'll give those people who do know about that subject joy, references they understand, and that's kind of exciting. Losing the point. But yeah, I think we're having writers who don't fetishize that, who didn't grow up reading that and basically only that, and kind of people who kind of grew up watching, I don't know, anime, Full Metal Alchemist, and a kind of a very different approach to where the lines of science fiction and fantasy are, and I think that's really cool. And certainly, even video games have a very different approach to science, like science and fantasy, and that adds up and brings a new perspective. And I think that's really cool. Or into words there.
Okay. Yes. Suyi, I see you're also nodding.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I was thinking about when you kept when Jeannette was talking. I kept thinking about how, for especially fantasy that comes from the African continent. Sorry, not fantasy, science fiction that comes from the African continent. Because science fiction, as Jeannette said, has been strongly associated with hard science, physics, right, engineering and stuff like that. And the thing is, coming from a place that has had such a what's the word, that hasn't really had the same interpretations of these things with other parts of the world, especially the dominant parts of the world, the interpretations of these things like engineering is a good example, right? They're not always the same. And then there's also the fact that intertwined into the cultures from the continent, you have a lot of mystical elements that are also interpreted as their own sort of science, right? And so science fiction, as a result, becomes this very, thing that the technology and the mystical coexist side by side, as opposed to two disparate things. So fantasy and science fiction will almost always be the same thing. And I'm saying this because I spoke about on the panel about Afrofuturism yesterday, and this is literally what I said. I was like, futurism isn't always scientific futurism. It is the merger of both what the larger world thinks of as scientific, but also what these indigenous cultures think of as mystical to themselves. And then there's this mixture of both. Even in a story that's like very mainstream, like Black Panther, there is still the mystical, like, ever present, despite the fact that there's vibranium and there's all this technology. There's still the mystical ever present, and it's actually more. It's likelier to be like that than one or the other. And that's something that I always keep front and center when I'm writing, when I'm thinking of how stories form from these parts of the world.
I mean, separating the two feels like such a Western idea, right?
Yep.
It's rooted in the Enlightenment, right? Like the Enlightenment was this period that only really happened in Europe.
Sorry.
Just a moment. I just wanted to make sure that Gareth. Sorry, just a moment. I wanted to make sure that Gareth has a chance of an introduction as well, because he just managed to connect. So I wanted to make sure that he also gets to introduce himself.
Hi. Hi. I'm Gareth L. Powell. I'm a novelist.
Hi, Gareth.
Sorry I'm late.
Welcome.
I had some browser issues. Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah. Okay. So we can get back to, I think, what we were discussing, and what both Suyi and DongWon were saying reminded me of something that Akweke Emezi was saying about their work and how it has a different ontology than most other, not just like speculative or non-speculative fiction, but like fiction published in the Western world in general. And that just really resonated with me. And so I thought that we could also follow this line of thought along how the assumptions about how the world works and what can be the domain of science, what can be investigated in a scientific fashion relates to both science fantasy and its current resurgence. Yes, so I think back to DongWon.
I do want to insert an idea, and I'm sorry this is going a little bit off the question that you asked, but I kind of want to disrupt the concept of this panel slightly, because I do think science fantasy has also, we've been talking about how science fantasy is a really useful tool for sort of marginalized voices and global voices, but that said, science fantasy is also deeply in the roots of what we think of science fiction fantasy here in America. I mean, if we're looking at, Roger Zelazny, if we're looking at, I had a list of names on my head that has completely just vanished, but, even Terry Brooks, even, there are these major voices in the genre that have always been. Say again?
The Ship Who Sang.
Yeah, exactly.
All the Capri stuff. Even Dragon Riders is.
Yeah, I was going to say those are
root of it,
dragons with laser guns, right?
They have the whole damn technology stuff.
Mm-hmm. Or even one of the biggest science fiction products that we consume culturally, Star Wars, is complete science fantasy, right? So I think the kind of the beating heart of the genre has always blended those elements, and I would actually say that hard, strict science-based fiction has always been in the minority, especially if we're talking sales-wise. It has been a very specific, smaller subset of the audience that may have been dominant in certain cultural conversations. But for me, I think it is a little bit of a misframing if we treat hard science fiction as the dominant voice in science fiction. And
even if you kind of look at something like comic books, have always been kind of very everything in one pot approach about it, good or badly. But on the other hand, I'm kind of thinking I I was reading a bunch of writing advice from stuff like Save the Cat, very popular stuff, and they have, not very fond of it, obviously, but they would say stuff like that you should only have one magical thing in your setting. Like you only want your audience to suspend their disbelief over one thing, which seems economical at first, but it breaks down when you think about, say, I don't know, Star Wars, which definitely has both the Force and spaceships and loads of weird aliens, and it kind of. And you kind of ask the question, and but this is a writing book that kind of very, with a completely straight face, tells you, Spider-Man, the Tobey Maguire one, by the way, you can see how old this book is terrible because the moment Green Goblin shows up, the audience stops caring because how could you possibly care about two super beings at the same time? And you could say, well, Jeannette, that's just one rando guy, but this is, I have been wrecked this book and books like this so many times in whenever people talk about writing advice and in kind of writing advice circles. And I think if you're asking one of the questions of why science fantasy took a while to get going in some circles, there are still people who believe, I mean, they may not be very successful, but they certainly believe that is what makes a good story.
And just to pick up on that real quick, and
actual success.
And then I'll shut up for a second. But, picking up what you're saying, Jeannette, like this idea of grounded science fiction and grounded fantasy is incredibly important in Hollywood, right? When you talk to anybody about what they're looking for, it's always grounded, grounded, grounded. And what they mean by that is exactly what you're describing, which is that one different science fictional element. They're looking for Black Mirror kind of concepts where it's like, here's the one thing. What if you had one robot? What if you had one weird, social network thing, right? And that is sort of the core of what mainstream Hollywood is looking for when they're looking for genre fiction. That old guard thing, that warrior nun thing, right? So it remains really dominant. I think it's important for us to sort of keep in mind as we're talking about these big, broad things that sort of the core of what people say they're looking for tends to be really limited in that way.
Mm-hmm. Gareth, do you also have any thoughts?
I'd say if you go back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which a lot of people pinpoint as the kickoff of the genre, then that is clearly fantasy because although it is based on some scientific ideas at the time, there was no way of bringing the dead back to life with lightning. So that it does have a healthy dose of it's got speculation, it's based on the kind of the Victorian sciences, but there's also a fantastical element in it. And I think when I'm talking about science fiction, I'm not talking about a treatise. I'm talking about it's people call it the literature of ideas. I prefer to think of it as the literature of analogies, and we use the future and we use these different settings as analogies for today. And so it's parables, I think, and to use it simply to explore exotic science is fine and interesting, but after a while you run out of science and you run out of people interested in just how arcane your science is. So it's much more interesting to me to use it as a distorting mirror in order to comment on who we are, where we're going.
Yeah, now that I think we have had multiple mentions of big classic works that are science fantasy, it made me think that we don't really have a kind of lineage for science fantasy as much as we would have for hard SF. And I was wondering, what would you say are kind of the foundational texts or important texts historically, or even lesser known, but to you personally very important works of science fantasy?
Can I go?
Mm-hmm, yes.
Okay, and this is very timely because I just wrote a piece for Tor that's probably gonna come out soon, and it spotlighted this superhero called Captain Africa, and I was basically drawing the lineage of Captain Africa from the 1970s, just early post-colonial times for West Africa. And the concept is that it's this superhero who has half his abilities are super speed, super flight, right? Which are borrowed from the Marvel and other comics that came in from the UK and the US and were sort of repurposed for the newly liberated African market, right? And then the other half was mystical abilities that were drawn from indigenous cultures, and this story was written by Captain Africa was written by a Ghanaian living in Nigeria at the time called Andy Ackman, and it was published. So it was literally the first own voices comic from the African continent, the very first, right? Because every other superhero at the time was written either by, it was always some foreign influence, either writing and bringing the comics in or setting up shop on the continent and producing these comics. But Captain Africa was actually the very first African own voices superhero, right? And was sent proliferated outside the continent. Like there was even a sort of profile in the New York Times about the superhero. But that's what Captain Africa was, what I grew up with, because I after a while it used to get published in newspapers, right? You had like small strips at the end of every newspaper. So like when my parents would buy the paper, I would like run and like, give me the back page, and I'd read that, and that was so it was this really good thing for me, because then we couldn't even get a lot of access to Marvel and the other comics. So that was literally what I grew up on. And that was sort of one of my foundations, because then I could afford to think about, super speed and super flight in just not a scientific way, but also I could see how it could tie, how super speed and super flight and invulnerability could tie into the stories I grew up with of my own communities, right? And it didn't feel like a foreign concept. It did start to feel like a foreign concept when I started to get more into the other stuff, where they're like, oh, gamma rays. I'm like, what are those? So yeah, I guess for me, that's a good example of how it was more of an inside out as opposed to the outside in. But I guess it's not always the same for a lot of people. And then most of the time they have to break down and find the center of what they think is their interpretation of these speculative stuff. Anyway, carry on.
I see, Jeannette, you're nodding very much, so I'm wondering if you have next sometime.
I was slightly wanting to contest the idea of Mary Shelley being the origin of science fiction, because I always wanted to root for Mary Cavendish's The Blazing World, which is it's a piece of utopian fiction. Duchess of Newcastle. She was a member of this she was a quasi member of kind of like a kind of posh scientist society for posh people, and they would do experiments. And the thing is, she, as a woman, despite being quite very rich and very powerful in all these ways, she wasn't allowed to be fully part of it, and she would write poetry about science. And I was kind of fascinated me because she would justify it by saying that, oh well, I'm writing poetry is like spinning of the mind. So that's why I should be writing poetry, because it's like spinning, and spinning is woman's work, and therefore I could be doing this. And her husband was kind of one of those amateur scientists, in the 17th century that every now and again does something mildly important and speculates about atoms or something. And she would write poems about atoms. And she wrote The Blazing World, and it's kind of this bizarre. It's kind of like a fantasy where she would get to be empress of this kingdom of animal people who will do science and theology, and they'll sit around and debate science and theology with her all day long. It's ridiculous. It's awful. And it's very imperialist, I have to say that as well. But what interests me in her is how she didn't see theology and kind of science as separate. She didn't see the idea that, writing poetry about science isn't this weird idea to her, that these ideas should coexist. And the kind of idea that science should be sterile or like not beautiful is something that I don't think that kind of, even in the kind of Enlightenment era back when science and magic parted ways, this idea that science is beautiful, that you should definitely do dances and the geometric patterns of the the stars and music of the spheres type stuff, and I'm into that, and I like to play with that in kind of my side, because nowadays when you talk about it, it sounds like magic, like music of the spheres, the planets sing to you, you should do dances and in pattern of the spheres, like it all sounds super mystical and weird, and spoilers, that's what I'm researching for my next book.
Cool. Okay, DongWon?
Yeah, I mean, science and mystical thinking have been so deeply intertwined in Western culture that, I was talking about the Enlightenment, but also Hermeticism stayed very alive and well. I mean, Isaac Newton was spending most of his time trying to, derive alchemical formulas from Hermetic texts, right? Like there was mystical thinking and scientific thinking in mystical practice throughout all of history. And so trying to separate the two, I think is a major challenge. But kind of going back to your original question, Bogi, I think there are really foundational texts like Dune, but and things like that. But for me, it's in the panel description, but fifth season is such a watershed moment, I think, in the genre. And I love that N.K. Jemisin did this thing where she just sort of grabbed fantasy and science at the same. I mean, it's a book about magic schools and wizards with powerful crystals, and like it's literally a book about crystal magic, right? And so when I stepped back and realized how much she was playing with the core fantasy components, and then expanding that into this very scientific thinking, and then this very science fictional thinking, it was sort of this thing where she just grabbed all parts of the genre and said, "No, you have to pay attention to me now." And you have to pay attention to this new way of thinking. And none of you are exempt from this critique that book makes. And, I think that is now a foundational text for a new era of science fiction and fantasy that I could not be more excited about. I often say that there was an era of fantasy where your reference point was Tolkien and now it's Jemisin. But I think that's true of science fiction as well, right? And, I'm not sure everyone's going to agree with me on this, but I do think that she has really thrown a gauntlet, intentionally or not, that everyone needs to address in their work going forward to be relevant.
Mm-hmm. Gareth?
I think the book that sprang to mind for me was Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, which is sort of very much has all the trappings of a fantasy, but then you start to realize that the towers and the castles dotted around the landscape are actually old spaceships, and that the magic is actually old technology being repurposed. I think they're very much the same from Michael Moorcock's Dancers at the End of Time, in the fact that their technology has advanced to the point where it is magic, and they don't understand how it works. They just use it to get what they want, and they can summon anything. So
Chronicle of Leibowitz also plays around with some of that.
Yeah.
With the future Doom Monks tech. And obviously it's the conceit of 40k as well.
Yes. But yeah, that's what sprang to mind for me anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My original idea was that, okay, we will do a round of like classics and then we will do a round of contemporary things, but contemporary things have already come up. So I was just
sorry about that.
No, so that's totally fine. And that's awesome because I think it really illustrates the panel's point that the science fantasy is really thriving right now. So I would say, like, what other works can you think of that are very contemporary and also kind of like experimental or new in this particular sense, where like that go where science fantasy hasn't gone before? Like here we had fifth season, but what else can we think of? And not just in like novels, but also in short fiction or even poetry or whatever you can think of.
I think for me, Aliette de Bodard's recent novellas have been fantastic. They're set in a world where ships are born biologically, spaceships are born biologically, and are therefore related to other members of a human family. And I think that's a fantastic conceit, and that's the novels themselves are just novellas. Sorry. Sort of explore everything through ritual and rather than through science. So it's
I'm thinking about.
I also love the confusionism of being able to talk to all your ancestors.
Yeah.
Yes, Suyi?
Oh yeah, I was saying I'm thinking about two people in particular, Nilo Hopkinson, who has been here for a while, but a lot of what Nilo writes is sort of neither or the other, and Nikki Gideon is kind of similar now, because a lot of her work as well, it's very similar in that way to Nilo, where it could be science fiction, it could be fantasy, depending on how you look at it. But one particular text that I think it's definitely fantasy, but the way the magical systems are designed, which is another thing I think, especially for fantasy, when you start to think about how intricately some of the magical systems are designed, they start to become scientific. I think it's called Foundry Side. That's the name of the novel. Yeah, where it's like the magical system is almost like writing code. It's like writing code and asking the magical or like giving instructions to an object, which is what code is.
That's Robert Jackson Bennett, by the way.
Yeah, Robert Jackson Bennett. That's the author's name. I think it's a series, so there's a second book out or something. But yeah, that's a good example of how you can draw on, even without drawing on, say, the technology or the engineering or the geology, you can draw on the concept even of something scientific into fantasy, or vice versa. Those are my examples.
I really enjoyed Gideon the Ninth for just sort of space gothic, I suppose you could call it more specifically, where sort of you have the kind of giant moldering cathedral-like buildings and the arches, and you have this rather repressed bratty teenager just taking you through it with her swagger. It's fantastic, and very much a world that has that kind of that strange. I think there's something very much where the emptiness and hugeness of space really add to the grandeur and the sublime sense of horror of Gothic. It mixes very well in a way that almost feels seamless to me, because the kind of the Gothic horror thing of like, you don't matter, these giant buildings, they're so big, they're so old, you're so small, you're gonna go crazy looking at them. And it's like, that's a lot like how people look at space sometimes. And I think that kind of just fits in a way that, feels very intuitive.
Yeah.
I think the comments are also erupting with suggestions.
Yes.
Oh, there's suggestions in the comments.
Yes, I can read some of them, because I think we have awesome suggestions in the comments, like there's Kaya Shanta Wilson, who has really great novellas and also short stories that are, I think, absolutely, and have that kind of organic sensibility that I think at least 2 or 3 of you have mentioned, that like science fantasy has this kind of like biological spaceships, organic elements, giving birth to spaceships, like in Aliat's work.
You can also have like a tonal thing. So one of the things I love about Kai Shante Wilson is the way he incorporates really contemporary vernacular English against this very ornate fantasy language, right? And like the way he particularly uses African-American vernacular English from the character speech, it was one of the most exciting things for me to read. And, you can have sort of tonal science fantasy in that way, where you have very contemporary and very classical at the same time. And to plug one of my own books, the Arkady Martin's A Memory Called Empire is very much a science fiction, very much a space opera, but it's set in the society that feels so epic fantasy in its structure, with like all the way the poetry works and the language works. It is absolutely a science fictional book, but it has all these tonal elements of fantasy. And, it was so much fun working on that and trying to figure out, okay, how do we sell this book that was able to hit both of those notes at the same time, and how it was framed and how it was sort of marketed and published. So,
yeah. And I think that brings us also to something that we discussed before the panel that we want to talk about a little bit, and it's about how genres are conceptualized differently when it comes both to readers and to the publishing industry per se, and to writers. So everyone has a different perspective on it. So how do you manage to squish yourselves into these like restrictive categories, that there's like the science fiction box and then there's the fantasy box, when what you're writing is like somewhere completely outside of those boxes, but also in them at the same time. So how do you like counteract this kind of like, when something fits in multiple places, sometimes the tendency is to categorize it as neither. And that can be frustrating to me as a reader because I really love science fantasy. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I want to run with it just a little bit because this is a big hobby horse of mine. One of the things I really want to point out is there are 3 different ways of thinking about genre. And whenever we get into these big internet fights about what genre means, it usually is because 2 different audiences trying to talk to each other and not understanding that they're speaking about different things, right? So there's the way publishers and booksellers, there's the industry way of thinking about genre, there's the critics way of thinking about genre, and then there's fan way of thinking about genre, right? And I'm mostly going to talk about the industry side, but critics and fans are concerned about like what a thing is based on the text and based on the history and the emergence. Publishing doesn't give a crap about that, right? Like we genuinely don't care about like, does this fit into a tradition or not? What we care about is, publishing is an industrialized capitalist business, right? Our job is to take these beautiful flowers of a story and figure out how to sell it to as many people as possible. And to put it into an industrial system, you literally have to put it in a box. So it can be packaged and shipped in quite literal and metaphorical ways. And so genre is the way in which we package and box something up. Because when you're publishing, in my view, the only question that really matters is who is this book for? And genre is one of the major ways that we communicate this book is for you. Do you like Star Wars? This book is for you. Do you like, hard science fiction? Do you like Greg Egan? This book is for you. Do you like fantasy? This book is for you, right? And that's why 5th season, for example, that we've talked about as this sprawling, covering everything, was packaged very specifically as epic fantasy. If you look at how that cover was designed, how it was marketed, how everyone talked about it before a publication, this is an epic fantasy from a big epic fantasy writer. It's epic fantasy over and over again was what you heard. And so when it came out, that's exactly how it was framed and sold. All these things that we're talking about that are science fantasy will be framed by the industry one way or the other so that it fits into that category. Because as you were saying, Bogi, if you don't do that well enough, it'll fall into that gap where no one really knows. If you don't know what shelf to put it on in the bookstore, you have a major problem. Now, that I've said that, everyone's thinking of some example of a book that has completely defied that, and that is possible, right? I think it is possible to have a book that is deliberately riding that line, but it's a difficult needle to thread. But even if you think about Gideon the Ninth, that's a science fiction book that is packaged and framed as a fantasy book. That's a fantasy-ass cover, right? That's a painted cover of somebody in this skull outfit, right? And it feels very much like that's a fantasy adventure heroine, even though what that book is very, very different from what that cover represents. Not in a way that it feels inappropriate. I think everyone who went into that got what they were looking for, but that book wasn't packaged like a big space opera science fiction book, even though you could make that argument too.
The King Arthur in Space one has there's that King Arthur in Space book recently, with the sword, the gauntlets, the rose.
Yep.
That had a really interesting cover because it had the kind of space feel as well as the sword feel for straddling that line. But perhaps King Arthur in Space is just a cleaner concept.
Right. And going back to Arkin and Martine again, because I can speak to how involved we were in that, we had all these conversations about, do we put a spaceship against a planet, which is the classic science fiction space opera look? And we were like, no, we want something fresher and something that feels different. So we went with this painted image of a throne because, literally our reference image was the Star Wars, the second Star Wars of the new trilogy, I'm blanking on what it's called, the throne room fight scene from that. We wanted that big, stark fantasy throne feel, and that's kind of what we went for with this painted cover. And that was us trying to thread that needle of this is both science fiction and fantasy feeling. And it seems like we did hit that appropriately, but these are the questions that we're thinking about when we're publishing a book, and that's how genre plays in here, which is why so many fans are like, this book wasn't that. Why did you market it that way? What's wrong with you people? Why don't you understand what genre is? And the reality is we just are solving for different solutions than what you are as a reader or a critic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sorry, my rant is done.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it is frustrating that you think this book would have interested you if you were sold that book. which is always that. Because I was really excited about Jen Lian's book. Oh God, was it quite a generic
Rune of
name
Kings.
as well?
The Rune of
Yes,
Kings.
Rune Kings. Yes, and it has this quite epic fantasy generic cover to me. But it's this multi-voiced, brimming with footnotes. It's this kind of mindfuck of a postmodern explosion to me, and it's fantastic. But the cover promises me third-person epic fantasy of the most generic type you can imagine. This is gonna be like the 50 millionth hero's journey you've read, Jeannette. And like the contents didn't feel like that. It was very
But you have to understand,
kind of like this cacophony.
But that approach
a lot of the
worked,
people
right?
who
That
did
book-
read it because of the didn't like it. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you
DongWon?
missed a certain
Yeah.
audience, but also it hit a really big audience, right? It hit
Yeah.
the core fantasy readers. So a lot of people bought that book. A lot of people read that book and were excited about that. We're talking about Rune of Kings by Jen Lyons. Sorry,
Yes.
I saw a comment in the chat. And, you know, that they were right to publish it that way, right? Even though, yes, the problem is when you make that choice, you're going to lose somebody, right? And if you made the choice to publish this as this postmodern, technically dense thing, then you're going to lose a bunch of people who wanted the fantasy side of that, right? And so it is, that's the trade-off. That's the entire challenge. And it sucks is the reality of it because
But
business
I
is
couldn't
shitty.
find it.
I know.
Yeah.
But that's capitalism for you, right? That's
Yeah.
marketing for you. That's
Yeah.
publishing, you know?
Yes.
So.
Yes. And I see, Suyi, you're nodding, and also you have literally your own book behind you. So we have heard a lot and discussed a lot about the publishing side, but what about the writing side?
Yeah, like, I mean, I think they're all intertwined, right? I think the people I worry most about are editors because they're in that space between the publishing side and the writing side, and they're like, oh no, how do we, place this? It's like what DongWon was saying. My book had the same problem. I call it the Godpocalypse. My editor called it God Punk, and the people in Lagos called it urban fantasy. Or a post-apocalypse. Like people called it different things because it wasn't really one thing, because it couldn't be, right? It was an apocalypse caused by gods. And it was like, what is that? Is it fantasy? Is it dystopia? Because there's folks like it's a dystopia. I'm like, that's not really a dystopia though, because like Lagos doesn't really change too much after the gods arrived, So it was like all these things, and it made for very interesting discussion, funny enough. But you would not believe that when I was writing it, I didn't think about genre. I was just like, oh, gods in Lagos, that would be cool. And that was pretty much it. That was the extent of my thoughts. So I guess on the writing side, I think kind of what DongWon is saying here is, as a writer, you're really just thinking about the core of your story. Sometimes that core will blend so many elements that you don't really think about until you get to the table where someone who's like a packager, right? In this case, which is what the publishing side is like, all right, so what packaging are we going to put this in and parcel it out to everyone? The cover, the blurb, the descriptions, everything is going to like tell one story. It's like your trailers we see for, Hollywood as well and stuff like that. It's like, how are we going to present this to the world? And if there's 5 things, then I'm sorry, we have to pick 1 or 2. Sometimes if the 2 are strong enough, The Mandalorian is a good example. It's like space, but also Western. And you can manage to do one like big one, which is like space for The Mandalorian, and then one smaller attached one, which is like the Western for The Mandalorian. And sort of that way. But I think outside of that, you just kind of have to lose some people. It sucks. And I guess that's why as authors, you have to do many appearances so you can always be like, hey, there's also this other stuff you missed. Hi, everyone. Hello. Yeah.
So he's kind of making the point that I was hoping to make, which is genre is a publisher problem, not a writer problem. Y'all don't need to think about it, right? Like when you're writing, write the book of your heart, write the book that you want to write. Let us figure out, okay, how do we package this and sell this and market it? you will participate in that process, but that's not your problem and not something you should think about at the outset of telling a story. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Yes, Gareth?
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I was,
I'm interested in genre in terms of a taxonomy recipe kind of approach, because I like the idea of taking apart stories, putting them next to each other, and comparing them. But where I put them is very obviously very different from where you put them. Like the classic, you know, where tomatoes are in the supermarket is very different from where a botanist would put them versus where, you know, your home chef would put them. You know, where it would be most convenient for the shops to put an object is very different from the museum versus the, I don't know, me in the kitchen. But I do think that there is some use in looking at genre, at least for me, because it's a way of sorting things which are similar to each other and putting them apart. But I think that's just, I have a weirdly analytical mind like that. Because and like, you know, I feel like I write in a defunct genre because it's like, you know, I write the Gothic. The Gothic is not a genre these days. You can't go into the bookstore and go, ah, yes, this is the bookshelf full of Gothic books, because they're split across general fiction, classics, and science fiction and fantasy, and and historicals. Historicals are a different genre these days. And then they're very something. There's a word there.
Yes, and I think Gareth was starting to say something. Yes, so.
I was just picking up on DongWon's point about, as a writer, whether or not we worry about it when we're doing it. And my latest book from Titan, Light of Impossible Stars, basically features a big fight between a huge armada of spaceships and a huge pack of dragons. And I, you know, because I knew I was writing a space opera, but at the same time I can raid other toy cupboards while I'm doing it and take, like when you're cooking a stew and you just throw in bits from everywhere. It's so I don't overly concern myself with, is that a fantasy element? Is this as long as you put it all in there and it all has a reason to be in there, I think you can mix and match quite nicely.
Like, I suppose I find science in bunny ears. I find it useful when I look at like a fantasy world I'm writing about, and I ask a bunch of questions. I buy coffee for all my scientist friends and ask them questions, and if they ask me interesting questions in return, that's when it gets interesting to me. So it's the kind of, I always talk about, oh yes, you know, I've got my sun, it's on a pendulum. What would that make the day-night cycle look like? What would that do to my world? And I bought a physicist some coffee, and he was like, oh, but wouldn't that mean, if it was like an ever expanding plane, wouldn't that mean all the air is expanding outwards? Wouldn't that mean there's this wall of solid air around your fairyland? I'm like, yes. And he's like, wouldn't you run out of air because it would be constantly expanding outwards? I'm like, yes, you're right, it would. I should make some of my characters miners who mine the frozen air and drag it back into the middle of fairyland. That sounds hilarious. And I find it interesting to ask these sciencey questions because they give me interesting answers, not because it makes it more accurate, if that makes sense.
J.Y. Neon Young's. Oh, sorry.
Yes, DongWon?
I was going to say J.Y. Neon Young's books, the Black Tides of Heaven series. Did I just confuse the two titles? Yeah, no, Black Tides of Heaven is correct. Sorry. One thing that is completely invisible to the readers, but yet affects almost everything in those books, is that world is shaped like a donut. It's a torus, which is why the seasons and the days are weird. It's never explicitly put on the page, but it impacts almost every part of that story. And it's just like this little thing that I happen to know because they mentioned it to me at some point. I was like, wait, what? What are you talking about? And, you know, it's fun how these science details can really inform the fantastical elements. And, you know, gravity is weird in certain places, which causes the animals to grow weird, which is why you have giant dinosaurs. And, you know, that is a consequence of the fact that the world is a torus and stuff like that, where I was just like, oh, I had no idea. And those are things that just enrich the story and make it fun. And then Neon wanted to find a way to make it make sense in their head. So that's how it all worked. And, you know, I think that is the power of playing with science fantasy is, yeah, put it in because it's fun. And then you make it all work together because that's also fun. Consistency is way more important than accuracy, in my opinion. So.
And I think that now might also be the time for some audience questions. If anyone has anything, I'm looking through the comments.
I did see a question earlier that
yes.
I wanted to bring back to from, I'm just going to pull it up. Let's see. Worlds in Ink. The person asks if there's a distinctive genre focus, if it's a marketing thing. Yeah, that's it right there. And I was thinking about how, especially when you're thinking about how books make it to Hollywood these days, this starts to become like, it's like the books that are ready made for Hollywood almost always make it to Hollywood. While if you're writing, and I think like this is a thing that I guess writers are starting to worry about, like, okay, is this going to be easy to package for film, TV rights or whatever? And so I do think, yes, to a degree, there is a marketing thing that I would say authors are starting to worry about now, because it does add to the success of your work, especially for like POC and, and indigenous people and BIPOC in general, right? And you're wondering if, you want to get the same visibility, right? And how trying to like write from the heart versus how do I make sure, or not make sure, but like, how do I see if I can, make this like very focused in a way that it can be presented? Because yes, for some parts of storytelling outside of the book itself, right? Like TV or audio or some other forms or comics even, it's almost like the flatter it is, the more accessible, which I think again in the end is the point of publishing. It's like, how many people can we make this accessible to? And yes, so I think it does have an effect, but again, I still think at the end it's less about flattening and more about how can you, there was something that one said that I remember, I've forgotten now, but it was like something like, how do you make this unique and consistent? And that's kind of like what makes it stand out, as opposed to making it less complex or more flat and easily, slot into some sort of marketing approach. Anyway.
The problem is if you cynically chase that thing of like, oh, this is going to fit exactly in that slot, you often miss that because there's nothing distinctive and exciting about it. So, it's this balancing thing of, you want to write a thing that feels really fresh and distinct, but also fits into a preconceived notion of what this thing is. And then from there, once you've gotten people hooked because they like epic fantasy, then you can wander off and do whatever cool, weird thing you want it to do. But there are successes in all kinds of ways. All kinds of strategies work. I've seen people aim for the center mark and hit it spot on. People do the weirdest freaking thing in the world and it becomes a huge success, right? Like, I think Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation is a great example of this. He was a weird writer doing weird stuff and ended up blowing up and ended up getting a movie and ended up all these different things. And it's very hard to predict those aspects. So that's why my advice is always just write the thing you want to write,
Poland has this very cool question that I think is also good for like a whole round of answers. What would you like to see more of in science fantasy? I see Jeannette is already trying to say something.
No, I was going to recycle my favorite analogy about how if you look at all food, you're like, oh yes, all if you look at all Italian recipes, all of them have pasta and olive oil, so I will make something with pasta and olive oil and maybe tomatoes, and you only have these three ingredients, and you're like, no, that's not a dish, that's not how cooking works. And it's exactly the same thing. If you look at only the elements of all the popular things have in common, you will have pulp. You'll end up with carb and oil. But yes, I think things I want to see more of. The titular dragons in Spaceship. I always love dragons, but I think I have a fascination with animalistic dragons, which are kind of based on kind of bioscience-y shit. So I don't know, dragons that are I think Mercedes Lackey did some books which were like ancient Egypty, but their dragons were this mix of kind of big cats and also kind of birds of prey. And it's very charming. I think it's very charming because it seems like she was really into both big cats and birds of prey and had some experiences with both. So it's very transparent. The characters all have backgrounds in these animal training, but it's always cool to see that kind of aspect of biology and animal training being brought into the work rather than just kind of, I don't know, biomechanics stuff of like, oh yes, dragons can't possibly fly because they have too many limbs or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Gareth?
I'd like to see more main characters who aren't chosen ones or who aren't, picked by destiny. Just to make a change, because it's something we've been through a lot. From Star Wars onwards, it's the narrative, isn't it? The hero's journey, which I think we need to maybe retire a bit and move on to sort of some of the slightly more less well trodden paths of myth.
I will say I feel like in some of these really quite tired old kind of tropes and stereotypes and archetypes, I keep feeling like there's something more that can be done with them. Every now and again I keep thinking it's like, okay, the chosen one stuff is awful, like, the chosen one secret bloodline bullshit is awful. But every now and again I'm like, oh, but the idea that, say, your family's keeping a secret from you because they want to protect you for reasons, I roll my eyes when it comes up in a story, but then I realize, wait, my family never tell me anything. Like, my grandfather has this entire backstory in the war that I've never heard of. So it's not implausible. I grew up with a family history that's full of, like, I'm not saying I am the chosen one. I'm just saying that this idea that our parents don't tell us shit is very relatable.
So
and yet,
many things.
all these versions of chosen ones with the parents who don't tell them things, I can't relate to that. It's written in a way that doesn't have that note in it for me. And I feel like, whilst a lot of the stuff that's being written or has been written doesn't quite work for me, there's something there. There are these notes that you could hit, and you're not hitting them right. Does that make sense? Like the secret bloodline stuff is bullshit, but trying to reconnect with a heritage that my parents don't care about, but I want to care about, that's something I can relate to. My parents thought that certain aspects of like my hacker heritage, they thought it wasn't important to me, and now I'm reading a hacker cookbook. Like, that's not the same thing as having secret magical blood, but it also kind of is, if you see what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
If you squint really hard. I think we could do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, like I was mentioning earlier,
The metaphors are
Jemisin made magic crystals exciting and fresh, right? Like, it's literally a book about wizards with magic crystals, and I was like, this is the most exciting thing I've ever read. So, anyways, go on.
Exactly.
Yes, Suyi?
Oh, I was going to draw from.
I do take on Campbell's. There's the soup should watch its back.
I was going to draw from I almost said Campbell's, Gareth's comments on myths, and what I think I would like to see more is about how people can draw from myths to solve scientific problems, or mystical interpretations of myth to solve science fiction problems. Again, this draws me back to Naylor Hopkinson and how she thinks about the intertwining. I like to think about Lagos a lot. Lagos is one of those places that's undergoing a lot of change climate-wise, right? And a lot of the changes people are putting forward aren't scientific. They're not like, all right, let's do XYZ science thing. Most of the time, they're thinking more, who do we pray to? Or how do we employ more traditional systems? Like, where do we plant trees? Where do we, and all of that is science, but is also mystical in a way for the people who, and however they interpret them. And one of the things I like to think about is how reclaiming change, right? Reclaiming what was lost in terms of change or in terms of trying to fix things that are traditionally fixed by science, right? In a more mystical sense, or both of them working together to fix that problem, because that's what's more natural to the place I come from. It's always a combination of both and very nearly never one or the other.
Yeah. I think that our hour is going to be soon up. So maybe like a few words as a final statement from everyone. And then I think we're going to say goodbye for now. Don't know who would like to go first. Jeannette?
I think for me, I kind of said this earlier, but, I want to reiterate it, is write the thing that you want to write. I think these are really interesting questions to examine from a critical standpoint and from a fan standpoint about what we're excited by, why we like a book, and then looking back and putting it within a heritage, a lineage of fiction, I think is always really exciting. But for you as a creative, if you want to put dragons fighting spaceships, absolutely do that. That's a great idea. That's a ton of fun, right? If you want to, do something that is purely using physics and math to metaphorically show us, what is the heart of a human story, then absolutely that works too, right? Science fiction and fantasy to me is all about metaphor. Gareth was kind of hitting on this earlier, and I think that's absolutely true. It's not predictive. It's not about the future. It's only about the present moment, and it's only about people, right? So whatever metaphors you want to use to tell that story that gives us an insight into human nature, do it. Do it if it's math. Do it if it's magic. Do it if it's space monks or dragons or whatever the hell it is. Go hog wild, have fun, write the story you want to write, and then let the process of the industry and the market figure out where it fits on the shelf. We can solve that problem. I've solved that problem in a million weird ways, in a million exciting ways. There are solutions, but you need to not worry about that in the creative moment. And then that's the thing that you figure out when you want to pitch it and sell it and market it.
Mm-hmm.
I second that. That's my own final statement. That's really where I was going to go.
Mm-hmm. Gareth?
Just that sometimes I think books can become science fantasy after the fact, which may have started off as science fiction, and then I'm thinking the one I'm thinking of is Samuel Delaney's Nova, which was it was possible when it was written, about diving into the heart of the star to get this rare element, but now the science is looking a bit more iffy, so you have to take it more as a kind of a metaphor for the Grail quest, which is what the book's about. But I think science fantasy is a bit of a movable feast in that way, that some books can be written as hard science fiction, but then shade into science fantasy as our understanding of science advances. So.
Mm-hmm. Jeannette?
I think I suppose I want to talk a little about literalisms to end on, which I think is just a strain in critique these days, because it's very easy, and it's very easy kind of to make jokes about this. It's kind of endemic in nerddom, the sort of Jack could have fit on that door to Rose Titanic critique, or like that kind of very nitpicky, very numbers driven, sciencey kind of, this is not a metaphor for anything, I just need to solve this plot as a problem. And it's not inherently bad to write stories that way, of course, or inherently bad to approach stories that way, but if you only approach stories that way, you're cutting yourself off from a lot of other ways to tell stories. And I think that's and that's something that really frustrates me when it comes to, I've enjoyed it a lot, that kind of nitpicking a lot of my life, but that is a foundation for so much nerd humor around kind of our media, makes me feel like we're missing the point of the magical metaphors that DongWon was talking about, that we have this powerful, that stories mean things beyond their immediate, this is a lamp, this is a sword, this is a door, and with something like Titanic, it's this moment of the choice Jack makes is that he's in the first blush of love, and he's willing to sacrifice that because he knows she will survive, and that's important to him. more than the idea that both of them would survive. And now that's the big dramatic sacrifice, and that's why it works or doesn't work. But you judge it on those terms, this kind of metaphorical big emotion terms, rather than the maths. And I'm like, I also, and yeah, like I feel like that's how I want to approach stories, with this openness to feels.
Yeah, and I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you everyone for participating, and thank you everyone who tuned in. We were very happy to have you, and wishing everyone a pleasant Fringe. There's still more stuff today, tomorrow, and have fun. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. This is a lot of fun.
Bye. This is great.